I'm Andrea Morrison. I'm Associate Professor of Economic Geography at Utrecht University, but I also have an affiliation with Bocconi University. I graduated at Bocconi University, and since many years I've been affiliated to the research center over there. And since 2010, I'm also adjunct professor of innovation and sustainability at Bocconi University. Quite recently, actually, I started a Mercury Fellow at the Department of Management at Bocconi University, and I will stay there for 2 years and then go back to Utrecht. If I look back to my PhD thesis, it was called Knowledge Flows in Industrial District. I must say that since then, I've been interested actually in knowledge diffusion and knowledge circulation, but not only within the context of local economies like industrial districts, but also more globally. So very recently I started a new line of research about migration and innovation, which is to a large extent still very much related to the idea that knowledge diffusion is important for innovation. In a very broad sense, my research interest from a disciplinary perspective, I would say that I'm interested in economics of innovation, economic geography, and economic development, and basically how innovation is a main ingredient for economic development, but also how geography plays a role in that process. Put it differently, I could say that I'm interested in the uneven distribution of innovation activities over space. So why some cities and countries are able to develop certain kind of innovation activities while others are not, or others take much longer to enter into these activities. This is something that is very new, or relatively new in the literature, and that's why it's particularly challenging to measure how global migrants might be, for example, proxied by inventors. So those scientists and technologies that patent their ideas in the patent office. So basically you can measure their contribution to innovation through the patent, but at the same time, while patenting, they also provide information about where they come from, which is crucial to understand whether they are migrants or not, and also where they work. Actually, this is also very challenging because not all patents provide information about the origin of the inventor. So in order to discover whether an inventor actually is a migrant, so is a foreign born with respect to the country is working or she's working in, you had to use some methodology to extract additional information. And these can be very challenging if you use relatively large data set made of thousands or millions of observation. So what I'm doing now with some colleagues and with the Mercury grant I got from European Commission is to examine a large data set of historical patents in the US and try to identify foreign migrants. So these are mainly Europeans who moved between the early 19th century till the early 20th century, and while moving from Europe to the US, they were basically going in different locations. Partly concentrated on the East Coast, like New York, but also many other locations in the Midwest or in the West Coast. So it's quite interesting to map this contribution of migrants to innovation and knowledge activities in the US throughout the period of more or less 100 years. that's a very good question, because most of the attention today is related to global talents that move especially from Asia. So think about Indian and Chinese engineer or students moving to the US, and in particular to some US location. Kendall Square in Boston, so a very small location where biotech is organized, or San Jose, Silicon Valley area, right? So the geography has changed, of course, but what it is interesting is first to notice that already back in the second industrial revolution, we observed a similar phenomenon. There is a very nice picture in a book of a famous economic historian, which I don't remember how to pronounce, but is Hughes, in which you have a picture of Charles Steinmetz and Edison. And you see Charles Steinmetz basically discussing with Edison about some products and some innovation he was developing in the laboratory. And who is Charles Steinmetz? He was a main consultant of General Electric. He was a refugee in a way, since he had to leave Germany because he was persecuted because of his political ideas, and he was also a physicist and mathematician. So he moved to the US, and he greatly contributed to the US innovation system in two ways. Directly, because of patenting, so he was directly patenting new inventions, but more broadly, what you would call knowledge spillovers, because he was telling to the researchers at General Electric how to carry out research. So not just doing trial and error, but actually applying mathematical models. Is this very different from what you observe today? As I say, the geography changed, which means that at that time, US was a fairly underdeveloped country. It was rising as a superpower, so US needed the knowledge, which was mainly in Europe. So many of those high-skilled migrants, or migrants that became skilled when moving to US, provided that knowledge. Actually, one of the findings we have is that we can proxy this knowledge that is produced in Europe, and we do see that regions that attracted migrants with a certain type of knowledge actually diversified in fields which were very close to those of the region of origin, the country of origin of the migrants themselves. What we have now is a bit different, because actually you see the reverse. US is a global technological power, and you see actually US pulling talents, but from generally underdeveloped countries, or emerging countries and emerging economies. From Africa, from Latin America, from China, where China is growing a lot and is catching up technologically, but at the very beginning this was not the case. Korea, Taiwan, India, so it was rather the opposite. Of course, this is not a static picture, this is a dynamic picture. When Koreans in the early 50s and then the 60s were moving to US to study and then went back, of course Korea at that time was not a technological power, but nowadays, at least in certain technology, Korea it is a power. So things might change in reverse, and this is also leave open for new avenues of research. One key example, although possibly is not, let's say, robust statistical evidence, is Nikola Tesla. I mean, some of the theories about electricity that Tesla developed back in Europe and then he further developed in the US, you clearly see those ideas being implemented, patented when he moved to certain regions of the US. That's one of those key inventors that helped US to fully enter into the era of electricity. Of course, this is not completely unrelated to what was happening in the US. Edison was already there. Actually, Tesla, when moved to the US, started working with Edison, but then it started also entering different subfields of electricity. Marconi was also an Italian scientist, and he also was a major contribution along with Tesla on technology related to communication. And you do see emerging in the US fields and companies that are related to communication technologies. The production of knowledge, of course, is not one way. You cannot clearly just say that knowledge was imported, and because of this knowledge was imported, you do see the emergence of something. It's a recombination process. So actually, our interest is to show that regions can renew themselves and can renew their pool of knowledge based on these recombinant processes. But in this recombination, actually it's important to understand how much of the knowledge comes also from outside, and how this knowledge that comes from outside helps the process of renewal. And renewal basically can be understood also in terms of diversification, entering into new technological fields which might lead later to new industries. And this is somehow what you observe also in other studies. What we want to point out is that it's important to look into these global connections and also to understand the agency process. So there are specific actors that actually in my research I also call gatekeepers that allow the transmission. So the process is not automatic or deterministic, but actually you need to have some specific actors that facilitate, in this case the bridge, basically, the bridge between distant geographies, distant location. And that explains also why there is a role for policy. While on the one side we generally look at migration as a cost, actually in my research I tend to look at migration, in particular high-skill migration, as an opportunity. Opportunity not only for the individuals that move, but actually for the regions and country that attract those migrants. And what we see today is that there is a race to attract the brightest minds in the world. And this race is done by companies, of course, the big corporations that want to attract those migrants, but also by regions. Regions set up so-called knowledge center or expat center to try to keep, for example, international students. This is something that I observe very much in the Netherlands, and in some university and research center in the Netherlands where they are especially in peripheral regions, so do not benefit, for example, from the positive dynamics of more core regions. So what they try to do is through university, which represent the main hub or gatekeepers to attract foreign talents, is to attract the students and to retain those students. So they have to first design policy to attract potential talents, but also need to have policies to retain those talents there, which sometimes in a very dynamic economic environments like the Netherlands, it might be easier than other places, but you have to consider also that these talents are very much footloose. So they spot opportunities and they might decide to move very quickly from one place to another. There are countries like Australia, for example, and also Canada that have a so-called point-based system. So they try to attract people that they feel might be most needed in their own country. So they give points to these applicants for a visa based on the skill they have. And this skill might be just having the language, knowing a bit of English, knowing a bit of French or whatever, or can be the type of education they have, tertiary education, high school, or the type of specialization, engineers, STEM occupation in general, but could be also other fields or other criteria. So selectivity could be also very important. What we observe within Europe is that we are considered as a single market, but this is not true for migrants from outside Europe. So when you enter with a visa, an employment visa within Italy, it's hard for you to start up an activity or move to another company in another country. So it's not a single market anymore. And of course, if I'm a talent and I have to decide where to go to a big market like US or a big market like Europe, but I see that in Europe actually I have many restrictions, then I might tend to prefer US or prefer any other big economic area. So there are already many attempts to reform the EU migration policy, but of course this is very difficult because, as you know, nowadays most people actually would like not to have more migrants, irrespective of the fact that they are high skilled or low skilled. But we might suffer from that because what emerged clearly in the literature is that the new main input for growth, economic growth and development is talent, or if you want, knowledge. So if we lose the best and the brightest, we might enter into a vicious cycle of decline. It is certainly true the case that certain countries are big attractors, and while attracting this talent, actually they diverge from latecomers. So US, and actually within US, certain areas of the US observe growth and economic growth, but also as measured by technological advances, much higher than other countries, but actually much higher than other regions within the US itself. So migration can exacerbate divergence within countries in particular. There is a literature on the great divergence within the US, and certainly the places that attracted most of those global talents, think about Silicon Valley, Boston, are those places that were growing the most. That is something that you might experience also in other places of the world, where you have these global clusters, global technological clusters. So you observe it within India, within China, also within individual, within countries of Europe. The question is how to tackle this from a policy perspective, how to compensate for this possibly inevitable costs which pertain to migration, but more in general to agglomeration forces. So there are some agglomeration forces that attract capital, financial capital, physical capital, and including human capital like migrants. So what are the policies that you can put in place partly to attract people to other places, so more peripheral places, or to compensate the losers, let's say, of this process. And some countries are implementing those policies. Again, going back to Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, for example, they offer regional visas in which if you are a talent and you want to enter Canada, there are specific programs to go to specific places. So you are an engineer from France, from India, from China, and you have a fast-track access to peripheral area of Canada. So you won't go to Montreal or Toronto, but for a certain number of years you have to accept to stay in another place which is less populated and is in need of your skills. And these policies might be effective, and we could think of these policies also within the context of peripheral regions within Europe.